Astoria, Oregon smelled of low-tide rotting fish guts and rusted iron. It was a miserable, perpetually damp purgatory at the edge of the world. To me, it was paradise. It was the exact opposite of the sterile, temperature-controlled penthouse in Manhattan where Victor Sterling kept me. I hoisted a crate of frozen mackerel onto my shoulder, biting my lower lip as a sharp ache radiated through my lower back. I was 16 weeks along now. Beneath the oversized, grease-stained canvas jacket, my stomach had thickened into a solid, undeniable curve. The parasite, as Victor had called it on the night I ran, was growing. "Move it, Leo. That truck ain't gonna load itself." Hank's gravelly voice cut through the relentless drumming of rain against the cannery's corrugated tin roof. Hank was a half-deaf, perpetually furious beta who owned the place. He paid in cash, asked 0 questions, and didn't care that I looked like a stiff breeze could break me in half. I grunted, dropping the crate onto the wooden pallet. I reached up, pressing 2 fingers against the industrial-grade scent blocker plastered over my scent gland. The chemical adhesive was eating away my skin, leaving a weeping blister, but it did its job. It kept the biological scream of my pregnancy, the sweet, cloying scent of warm milk and crushed figs locked away. It kept me hidden from the predators, from him. But out here on the docks, Victor wasn't the only predator. The screech of tires on wet asphalt drowned out the rain. 3 rusted pickup trucks slammed to a halt, blocking the loading bays. Doors clicked open. The heavy, suffocating stench of cheap beer, stale tobacco, and aggressive alpha pheromones rolled into the warehouse like a toxic fog. Local enforcers, the Shoreline Mafia. I immediately stepped back into the shadows of a towering stack of empty oil drums. Shrink, hide, don't make a sound. It was the survival mechanism Victor had drilled into me. You are an Omega. You are fragile. You belong behind my walls. Rent's do old man, the lead alpha spat. He was a mountain of muscle wrapped in a cheap leather jacket, a crowbar swinging casually in his massive fist. Hank didn't flinch. He picked up a clipboard. "I paid you leeches last week. Get off my dock before I call the Coast Guard." It happened fast. The alpha lunged, swatting the clipboard away before driving a heavy work boot directly into Hank's gut. The old beta folded like paper, hitting the wet concrete with a sickening thud. The 2 other thugs laughed, stepping forward to kick the old man while he was down. From my hiding spot, my breathing stopped. I closed my eyes, waiting for the familiar, paralyzing fear to wash over me. I waited to freeze. But the fear didn't come. Instead, something else clawed its way up my throat. It was a visceral burning sensation starting from the cluster of cells, multiplying beneath my ribs and exploding into my brain. Hormones, maternal instinct, a biological feral need to protect my territory. My eyes snapped open. The trembling in my hands vanished, replaced by an eerie, dead calm steadiness. My fingers wrapped around the handle of a heavy, solid steel industrial wrench resting on an oil drum. It weighed at least 10 pounds, but right now it felt as light as a feather. I stepped out of the shadows. The first thug didn't even see me coming. I swung the wrench with both hands. The sickening sound of solid steel connecting with his jaw echoed sharply through the cavernous warehouse. He dropped like a stone, completely unconscious before he hit the ground. The other 2 spun around, their eyes widening in shock. "What the?" I didn't let them finish. I wasn't an obedient, delicate pet anymore. The ragged, panicked gasps that used to leave my throat morphed into a low, guttural snarl, a sound so primal and dark I didn't recognize it as my own. The second alpha lunged at me. I ducked underneath his clumsy swing, pivoting on my heel, and drove the heavy head of the wrench directly into his knee. Bone snapped. He screamed, dropping to the floor. I didn't hesitate. I brought the wrench down across his collarbone, accompanied by a deafening metallic noise of the metal ricocheting off an empty oil drum beside him. 2 down. The leader stared at me, the crowbar slipping in his grip. The arrogant sneer was wiped clean off his face. I didn't look like a threat. I was a pale, shivering runaway in a filthy jacket. But my eyes were completely dead, locked onto him with the terrifying, unhinged focus of an animal backed into a corner. He roared and charged. I sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him forward, and slammed the wrench squarely into the back of his neck. He crashed face first into the concrete, sliding to a halt at my boots. The entire warehouse was dead silent. The only sound was the rain and my own heavy, ragged breathing. I walked over to the leader, slamming the heavy heel of my combat boot squarely onto the center of his chest, pinning him down. My skin was on fire. The adrenaline was boiling my blood, making the infected skin beneath the scent patch throb with agonizing heat. I reached up to my neck, my fingers curled around the edge of the thick plastic blocker. With one violent jerk, I ripped it off. The pain was blinding, a white-hot flash of agony, but the release was absolute. My true scent exploded into the damp air of the warehouse. It wasn't the soft, submissive vanilla I used to wear for Victor. It was overwhelmingly thick, ripe figs, dark honey, and warm milk, but it was laced with a metallic, suffocating aura of pure bloodlust. It was a scent that demanded absolute submission. The dock workers who had been hiding behind the shipping containers slowly stepped out. They stared at the three massive thugs bleeding on the ground, and then up at me, standing over them with a bloody wrench radiating territorial dominance. One of the workers, a burly beta with anchors tattooed on his forearms, swallowed hard, visibly trembling under the weight of my pheromones. "Boss," he stammered, taking a step back in sheer awe. "Are you okay, boss, Leo?" I didn't answer. I just stared down at the bruised knuckles of my hands, feeling the furious protective pulse of the child inside me. I didn't know it then, but 3,000 miles away in a penthouse floating above the clouds of Manhattan, a high-frequency server pinged with a harsh red light. Victor Sterling sat at his mahogany desk, staring at a monitor. The AI facial recognition software he had integrated into the national security grid had finally found a match. A grainy, pixelated still frame from an ATM camera across the street from the Astoria docks flashed onto his screen. It was my face. The crystal whiskey glass in Victor's hand shattered. Blood dripped down his pale fingers, staining the pristine white cuffs of his shirt, but his slate-gray eyes didn't blink. The hunt was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The storm outside was intensifying, but the real hurricane was about to walk through the loading bay doors. I didn't have to see him to know he was here. I felt him. The barometric pressure inside the warehouse plummeted, sucking the oxygen out of the damp, salty air. Then came the sound. It wasn't the rattling hum of a delivery truck. It was the synchronized, aggressive roar of 3 V8 engines cutting through the rain. Tires hissed and screeched against the wet asphalt, stopping inches from the corrugated metal ramp. Car doors slammed in heavy armored unison. My workers, my pack, my feral, pregnant brain suddenly corrected, shifted nervously around me. There were about 50 of them, a rough, hardened crew of betas and unbonded alphas who usually spent their days gutting halibut and cursing at the weather. Right now, they were staring at the towering entrance, gripping their fillet knives and rusted iron hooks a little tighter. The thick, territorial pheromones I was bleeding into the air had tethered them to me. I was their omega now, and they were ready to die for the warehouse. The giant steel doors slowly rumbled upward on their tracks. The screech of unlubricated metal was deafening, and there he was. Victor Sterling stepped out of the coastal fog like a grim reaper draped in a $5,000 bespoke charcoal suit. He didn't carry an umbrella. The Oregon rain beaded on his broad shoulders, plastering his dark hair against his forehead. Flanking him were 6 massive private security contractors, all dressed in tactical black, their hands resting ominously on the holsters at their hips. But Victor was the real weapon. His scent, dry cedar black coffee, and the sharp, violent ozone of a lightning strike rolled into the cannery, instantly clashing with the smell of rotting fish guts and my own heavy, honey-laced bloodlust. I didn't run. I didn't shrink into the shadows. I was sitting on top of a stack of wooden pallets, my legs spread, my heavy combat boots resting on the rim of an empty oil drum. I was still wearing the filthy, oversized canvas jacket, but it was unzipped, exposing the grease-stained tank top clinging to my sweat-drenched chest. I popped a wooden toothpick into the corner of my mouth, rolling it between my teeth as I stared him down. Victor stopped 10 feet away. His slate-gray eyes, usually as cold and calculating as a machine, scanned the warehouse. He was looking for a victim. He was expecting the delicate, trembling pet who used to flinch when a door closed too loudly in his Manhattan penthouse. He expected to find me sobbing in a corner, begging for mercy. Instead, his eyes locked onto me. He took in the heavy steel wrench casually resting on my thigh, the bloody knuckles of my right hand, and the 3 unconscious Mafia thugs bleeding out on the concrete below me. I watched his brilliant Wall Street-trained brain completely short-circuit. A muscle feathered wildly in his sharp jaw. "Leo," Victor commanded. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, seismic rumble that vibrated right through the concrete floor and into the soles of my boots. It was the voice that had broken CEOs and bankrupted rival corporations. "Get down from there. Now." Before the pregnancy, that voice would have dropped me to my knees. Today, the cluster of cells in my stomach pulsed with a hot, protective fury. I didn't move an inch. I just tilted my head, chewing slowly on the toothpick. "You're tracking mud into my warehouse, Victor," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of the stuttering fear that used to define me. "Wipe your shoes, or wait outside." One of Victor's security guards stepped forward, his face twisting in alpha outrage at the disrespect shown to his boss. "Watch your mouth, you little—" The sound of 50 blades being drawn at once echoed through the cavernous space. It was a beautiful, terrifying symphony of rusted metal. The burly beta with the anchor tattoos stepped directly in front of the pallets, raising a massive, serrated ice pick. "You heard the boss." He growled, his voice thick with uncharacteristic aggression. "Take one more step toward Boss Leo, and I'll gut you like a sturgeon." Victor's security team immediately unclipped their holsters, drawing sleek, matte black firearms. The tension snapped taut, a tripwire ready to detonate. Victor raised a single-gloved hand, ordering his men to hold their fire. He stared at the wall of filthy knife-wielding dock workers, and then looked back up at me. His expression was a volatile mixture of utter disbelief and a dark, twisted fascination. "You run away to play street thug," Leo Victor sneered, though I could hear the microscopic crack in his composure. "You think these fishmongers can stop me from taking what is mine?" A heavy mechanical sound of a double-barreled shotgun being pumped cut through the standoff. From the small glass-paneled office in the back, Hank hobbled out. The old half-deaf beta wasn't wearing a shirt, just a pair of waterproof overalls stained with years of marine blood. He kept the barrel of the rusted shotgun pointed squarely at the center of Victor's chest. "I don't know what kind of fancy Wall Street broker you are," Hank shouted, his gravelly voice completely unaffected by Victor's suffocating alpha pheromones. "But if you think you can just bust into my cannery and steal my best forklift operator, you've got another thing coming." Victor, a man who regularly had lunch with senators, blinked. For the first time in his life, he was utterly speechless. "I am not a broker." Victor ground out, his eyes flashing with lethal intent. "I am his bonded alpha, and I am taking him home." "Speak up, boy. The machinery wrecked my hearing in '98. Hank yelled back aggressively, waving the shotgun. "You want to buy canned mackerel wholesale. You go to the front office, you pull a paper ticket from the red dispenser, and you wait your damn turn. Otherwise, get your shiny black cars off my loading dock before I blow a hole in that expensive suit." A deadly silence fell over the warehouse. The absurdity of the situation hung heavily in the damp air. The world's most ruthless billionaire was being held at gunpoint by a deaf senior citizen who thought he was a pushy seafood buyer. I couldn't help it. A low, dark chuckle rumbled in my chest. I reached down into a plastic bucket beside the pallets, my fingers wrapped around the slimy tail of a dead, glassy-eyed mackerel. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed it. The dead fish sailed through the air and landed with a wet, heavy sound directly on the toe of Victor's immaculate, mirror-polished Italian leather shoe. Victor stared down at the dead fish. Then slowly his eyes lifted to meet mine. The sheer, unadulterated murder in his gaze would have frozen hell itself. I spit the toothpick out, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "You heard the man, Sterling," I whispered, my voice dripping with venom and a brand new, terrifying kind of freedom. "Get a ticket." War didn't come to Astoria with the roar of gunfire. It arrived with the silent, insidious hum of cooling servers and the flashing lights of fiber optic routers. Victor Sterling, a man who could crash a European nation's currency before his morning espresso, had realized that a frontal assault with armed guards wouldn't work. Not with 50 knife-wielding fishmongers protecting me, and certainly not with a deaf beta holding a shotgun to his chest. Furthermore, Victor possessed a terrifyingly precise possessive logic. A physical fight meant I might get pushed, bumped, or hurt. He would never risk the cargo I was carrying. So he did what he did best. He weaponized his checkbook. Within 48 hours, the abandoned, rotting warehouse directly across the street from Hank's cannery was transformed. Armored trucks delivered rows of supercomputers. Private satellite dishes sprouted from the rusted tin roof like high-tech metallic fungi. Hank slammed his ledger down on my makeshift plywood desk, his weathered face red with fury. "We're dead in the water. Leo, every single commercial fishing vessel on the West Coast just canceled their contracts with us. I leaned back in my rolling chair, pressing a hand to my lower back to ease the dull ache of my second trimester. What do you mean they canceled? We've got exclusive distribution rights. Not anymore, Hank bellowed, slapping a printed fax onto the disc. Some ghost corporation out of Delaware just bought up the entire regional supply of Pacific mackerel. They offered the captains triple the market price, paid in advance, direct wire transfers. I stared through the rain-streaked window at the glowing warehouse across the street. Victor. He hadn't just bought the fish, he had deployed his proprietary high-frequency trading bots. The AI algorithms usually reserved for monopolizing lithium mines or crushing tech startups were currently analyzing global weather patterns, ocean currents, and diesel prices to systematically starve our little cannery out of existence. He was blockading us financially. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to look at the empty loading bays, realize I couldn't feed my workers, and come crawling across the street to beg for my gold-plated collar back. A sharp, spiteful kick fluttered in my stomach. The baby agreed with me. We weren't surrendering. The hormones boiling in my blood didn't make me want to cry. They made me want to burn his empire to the ground. Hank, I said, my voice dropping into that eerie, dead calm register that always made the dock workers nervously touch their collars. The commercial fleets are tracked by GPS and digital manifests, right? That's how his AI buys them out before they even dock. Yeah, Hank grunted. So what? So we stopped playing on his grid. I stood up, grabbing me heavy canvas coat. Call the Ghost Fleet. Hank's good ear twitched. The smugglers, Leo, those guys are completely off the books. They run unregistered skiffs. They deal strictly in physical cash and untraceable bullion. It's cartel territory. Exactly. I smirked, an expression I had unknowingly picked up from the very man trying to ruin me. You can't algorithm a cash transaction in a dark alley. Tell the local boys we are paying 10% above the black market rate in cash for every crate of mackerel they can sneak past the Coast Guard. Let's see his Wall Street servers try to process a handshake deal made by a toothless pirate named One-Eyed Pete. For the next 2 weeks, the Astoria docks became the hub of the most absurd high-stakes smuggling ring in modern history. In the dead of night, dozens of small rusted crab boats and unregistered skiffs glided into our docks with their lights cut, bypassing the digital radar entirely. We unloaded thousands of pounds of fish by hand. We paid them in grease-stained duffel bags full of $20 bills. We distributed the canned goods using fake vegetable trucks driving on back roads. Victor's multi-billion-dollar AI system was completely blind to it. We broke his flawless silicon-brained algorithm with sheer, unadulterated redneck spite. By day 14, the heavy oak doors of the high-tech warehouse across the street swung open. A single man in a black suit walked through the rain holding an old-fashioned white envelope. He handed it to one of my guards and left. Inside was a single piece of heavy embossed cardstock. The Rusty Anchor, Midnight, Come Alone, V. The Rusty Anchor was a dive bar situated on the very edge of the pier. It smelled intensely of stale beer bleach and decades of bad decisions. When I walked through the creaking wooden doors at midnight, the place was completely empty save for the bartender who had clearly been bribed heavily to stare at the wall. Victor was sitting in the darkest corner booth. He looked entirely out of place. His dark wool trench coat and pristine Italian suit sharply contrasted with the ripped vinyl booth and sticky floor. But he wasn't looking at the grime. His slate gray eyes were locked onto me the moment I stepped inside. I didn't shrink. I walked over my combat boots, thudding heavily against the floorboards. I unzipped my jacket, letting it fall open to reveal the very obvious solid swell of my belly beneath a tight black t-shirt. I sat down opposite him, sliding a glass of lukewarm tap water across the table. "You look terrible, Victor," I noted casually. It was true. The pristine alpha was fraying at the edges. His jaw was lined with dark stubble, and his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. The scent of bitter, angry ozone rolled off him in suffocating waves, violently crashing against my own heavy, combative scent of dark honey and metallic bloodlust. "You broke my algorithm," Victor said. His voice was a low, seismic rumble stripped of its usual corporate polish. It sounded feral. "Algorithms rely on logic," I replied, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the sticky table. "You forgot that you're dealing with a pregnant runaway Omega and a town full of stubborn, half-drunk fishermen. There is no logic here, Victor. Just survival." Victor stared at me. He didn't look at my stomach. He looked directly into my eyes. For 3 years, he had seen me as a delicate, beautiful pet. a fragile porcelain doll to be locked in a penthouse and protected from the world. But right now, sitting in this putrid bar, looking at the Mafia boss, I had inadvertently become something in his gaze fundamentally shifted. The cold calculation in his eyes melted away, replaced by a dark, twisting fascination. It wasn't just alpha possessiveness anymore. It was respect. It was a raw, dangerous hunger. "My beautiful, brilliant little street thug," he murmured, his voice dripping with a dark, suffocating adoration. "You aren't a pet at all, are you, Leo? You're a goddamn queen." The air between us snapped with a violent sexual electricity. It wasn't the end of the war, but it was the end of his illusions. The billionaire wasn't here to rescue his fragile Omega anymore. He was here to conquer his equal. The storm hit Astoria like a localized apocalypse. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, tearing off loose tin shingles from the warehouse roof and hurling them into the churning black ocean. Inside the cannery, the air was freezing damp and thick with the smell of panicked sweat and rotting bait. Hank and the boys were desperately trying to secure the massive rusted steel loading doors against the gale force winds, their voices entirely swallowed by the roar of the tempest. Then the sound of the storm was violently eclipsed. A sharp, deafening noise of a high-caliber gunshot erupted. The heavy lock on the side entrance shattered into jagged metal shrapnel. A pair of matte black SUVs drove straight through the splintered wooden framing, their high beams cutting through the dim, dusty air of the warehouse like blinding strobe lights. Tires hissed on the wet concrete. Doors slammed open. Men poured out dressed in tactical gear. They weren't the local switchblade-toting thugs I had beaten up weeks ago. These men moved with military precision, carrying suppressed submachine guns. The local mafia had been bought out, or rather taken over. My dock workers, brave as they were, hesitated. Fillet knives and rusted hooks were no match for automatic weapons. The heavy metallic click of safeties being disengaged echoed ominously over the drumming rain. I didn't shrink. I reached down, my fingers wrapping tightly around the familiar solid weight of my industrial steel wrench. I stepped forward, stepping directly in front of Hank, shielding the old beta with my body. My pheromones spiked, bleeding a heavy combative scent of dark honey and sour ozone into the freezing air. A figure stepped out of the lead SUV. He didn't look like a mobster. Despite the heavy waterproof coat he wore, his posture carried the rigid, ghostly echo of a Manhattan boardroom. He stepped into the flickering light of a swinging overhead bulb. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and burning with a feverish, unhinged hatred. I recognized him instantly from the corporate gala photos Victor used to leave on the penthouse coffee table. Marcus. He was the former vice president of operations, the steady, loyal beta that Victor had ruthlessly fired simply for requesting a 6-week paternity leave to care for his newborn child. "Hello, Leo." Marcus rasped, his voice a jagged edge of pure bitterness. The stench of stale whiskey, cheap cigars, and desperate revenge rolled off him in nauseating waves. "Marcus," I breathed, my grip on the wrench tightening until my knuckles turned white. "Sterling took my life." Marcus spat, pacing slowly toward me, stepping over a scattered pile of mackerel. "He threw me out into the street because my child was an inconvenience to his bottom line. I lost my career. I lost my home. My wife took the baby and left me." He let out a hollow, grating laugh that chilled me to the bone. "And now the great, untouchable Victor Sterling is tearing up the entire West Coast, burning millions of dollars, all for a runaway pregnant Omega." Marcus stopped 10 feet away. He drew a heavy serrated hunting knife from his belt. The blade gleamed wickedly in the dim light. "I'm going to take his family." "Leo," Marcus whispered, his eyes dropping to the pronounced swell of my stomach beneath my dark t-shirt. "I'm going to carve that little parasite out of you, put it in a jar, and mail it to his penthouse." My blood ran ice cold, and then it boiled. A feral guttural snarl ripped from my throat, the maternal instinct overriding every ounce of logical fear in my brain. I raised the 10-pound steel wrench high above my head, ready to lunge forward and crush his skull. But halfway through the motion, my body committed a devastating betrayal. A blinding white-hot pain ripped horizontally across my lower abdomen. It was a severe pregnancy contraction triggered by the massive spike of adrenaline and sheer physical exhaustion. All the air left my lungs in a choked gasp. The wrench slipped from my trembling fingers, hitting the concrete with a hollow metallic clatter. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my stomach, gasping for breath as the warehouse floor tilted violently beneath me. I was completely, utterly defenseless. Marcus smiled. He raised the knife, stepping forward for the kill. Then the barometric pressure in the warehouse ceased to exist. The scent of ozone didn't just roll in, it detonated. It was a biological shockwave of pure, unadulterated murder. A roar tore through the warehouse, a sound so primal, so terrifyingly non-human that even Marcus's hardened mercenaries froze in sheer paralyzing terror. Victor didn't walk through the door. He collided with the scene like a freight train. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a dark, soaking wet Henley shirt that clung to his heavily corded muscles. He vaulted over a stack of wooden pallets, clearing them with predatory grace, and slammed into Marcus with the force of a falling meteor. The heavy hunting knife clattered away into the darkness. I watched panting and paralyzed by pain as the billionaire CEO fundamentally devolved into an apex predator. Victor grabbed Marcus by the collar of his jacket and the wrist of his knife arm. The sickening, wet sound of bone snapping echoed over the rain. Marcus screamed a high-pitched tearing sound of pure agony as his arm was bent backward at an impossible, grotesque angle. But Victor didn't stop. He threw the massive beta to the ground, pinning him to the concrete. Victor's fists came down in a relentless, brutal, sickening rhythm. Flesh tore. Blood sprayed across the wet floor, mixing with the seawater and fish oil. Heavy impacts echoed in a relentless, brutal, sickening rhythm. Simultaneously, shadows detached themselves from the walls. Victor's elite security team swarmed the building, neutralizing the rest of the gang with silenced, terrifying efficiency. But Victor ignored the gunfire around him. He was solely, obsessively focused on destroying the threat to his mate. His slate-gray eyes were entirely black, completely dilated with the bloodlust of a wolf defending its den. Mine. Victor snarled, his voice a demonic rasp, driving his bloodied fist into Marcus's jaw one last time, rendering the former VP completely unconscious and permanently disfigured. Silence fell over the center of the warehouse, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the heavy, ragged sound of Victor's breathing. He stood up slowly. His knuckles were split open, dripping thick crimson droplets onto the floor. His chest heaved. He looked like a monster. He looked like a god of war. Then he turned to me. The murderous darkness in his eyes instantly fractured, shattering into pieces, replaced by an agonizing, desperate panic. He dropped to his knees in the mud, and Fishguts, completely ignoring the grime, and slid across the floor to gather me into his arms. The scent of fresh, metallic blood mixed violently with his heavy, suffocating cedar and the sharp rain. Leo, he breathed, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of his corporate polish. His large, trembling hands frantically mapped my body, checking for stab wounds before pressing firmly and possessively against my stomach to feel the flutter of life inside. Leo, look at me. Are you hurt? Did he touch you? The pain in my abdomen was slowly subsiding into a dull, throbbing ache. I looked up at the man holding me. His face was pale, smeared with another man's blood. The pristine, calculating Wall Street machine was completely gone, leaving only the raw, desperately devoted alpha beneath. I reached up with a shaking hand, my fingers wrapped into the wet, blood-stained fabric of his shirt. I pulled him down, burying my face in the crook of his neck, inhaling the deep, grounding scent of his cedar. Victor let out a shuddering breath. He wrapped his massive arms tightly around my trembling frame, burying me against his broad chest, physically shielding me from the cold, the rain, and the rest of the world. He rocked me gently, pressing desperate, heated kisses to my wet hair. I closed my eyes. He was a tyrant. He was a ruthless manipulator. He was a monster. But as I listened to the frantic, terrified hammering of his heart against my ear, a dark, unavoidable truth settled deep into my bones. This monster was mine, and his blood-soaked arms were the safest iron cage in the entire world. The storm outside the clinic raged on, rain lashing heavily against the reinforced glass windows, but inside room 4, the atmosphere was a blinding clinical white. I sat on the edge of the examination table, the sterile paper crinkling loudly under my shifting weight. This wasn't the local community hospital. This was a private state-of-the-art medical facility that Victor had apparently purchased outright 45 minutes ago, simply because he deemed the local emergency room's hygiene standards unacceptable. The heavy scents of natural ozone, rotting fish, and metallic blood had been aggressively scrubbed away. Now my lungs were filled with the sharp, stinging odor of rubbing alcohol, bleached cotton, and the faint synthetic hum of expensive air filtration. My hands instinctively rested on my lower abdomen. The dull, throbbing ache of the stress contraction had finally faded, numbed by the IV drip of fluids and pregnancy-safe muscle relaxants taped to the back of my hand. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The terrified local physician practically scurried out into the hallway, leaving me completely alone with the apex predator. Victor stood motionless by the backlit X-ray board. He was still wearing the soaking wet, blood-stained Henley shirt from the warehouse. His knuckles were raw, split open and bruising a deep purple, a brutal physical testament to the horrific violence he had just unleashed to keep me safe. But his slate gray eyes weren't looking at me. They were locked, unblinking, onto the glossy black and white ultrasound film the doctor had just handed him. The room was deathly quiet save for one sound, the rhythmic, amplified sound of the fetal heartbeat echoing steadily from the ultrasound machine's monitor. This was it, the moment of execution. I braced myself, my fingernails digging deeply into the palms of my hands. I waited for the cold, calculated fury to detonate. I waited for him to spit out the word parasite. I waited for him to pull out his phone call, his elite medical concierge team in Manhattan, and schedule the immediate surgical extraction of the inconvenience that was ruining his perfectly ordered, sterile life. 4 months, Victor finally said. His voice was a low, seismic rumble that vibrated right through the sterile tiled walls. I flinched, pulling my knees slightly closer to my chest, a defensive instinct I couldn't suppress. Victor listened to me. Quiet. It wasn't a shout, it was a command laced with absolute suffocating authority. He stepped away from the light board, the ultrasound film gripped in his massive blood-flecked hand. He walked toward me with the slow, deliberate pacing of a wolf stalking a cornered deer. His dark eyes swept over my body. He took in the heavy combat boots, the grease-stained cargo pants, the bruises blooming on my collarbone, and finally, the undeniable solid curve of my abdomen beneath my thin, damp t-shirt. I closed my eyes, bracing for the disgust, bracing for the rejection. Instead, a large, remarkably warm hand cupped the side of my face. The heavy, grounding scent of cedar washed over me, pushing away the smell of the clinic, demanding my complete attention. I opened my eyes. Victor wasn't looking at my stomach with repulsion. He was looking at it with a dark, terrifyingly intense fascination. A muscle feathered rapidly in his sharp jaw. Then slowly, the corners of his mouth tipped upward into a smile that chilled me to the very marrow of my bones. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated megalomania. No wonder Victor whispered, his calloused thumb brushing a streak of dried mud and rainwater from my cheekbone. No wonder what I breathed, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against my ribs. No wonder you didn't freeze today, Leo. No wonder you shattered my multi-million-dollar trading algorithm with a fleet of ghost ships. No wonder you took a heavy steel wrench and crushed the skulls of 3 Mafia thugs without hesitating. His voice dropped into a ragged, deeply possessive purr. He leaned in so close I could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. You aren't just carrying a child. You are carrying my bloodline. I stared at him, my brain completely short-circuiting. The brilliant, ruthless Wall Street tycoon had entirely lost his mind. The sterling genetics. Victor continued, his eyes darkening to the color of wet asphalt, ablaze with a twisted, obsessive pride. They are literally coursing through your veins, rewriting your biology from the inside out. My DNA is acting as a biological catalyst. It stripped away your fragile omega conditioning and turned you into a feral, untouchable apex predator. It made you the undisputed ruler of this pathetic, rotting dock. A cold, horrified shiver violently racked my spine. He didn't see a baby. He didn't feel a warm, paternal glow of impending fatherhood. He looked at that ultrasound and saw a biological weapon. He saw a genetic upgrade. He saw a physical manifestation of his own supreme ego, enhancing his chosen mate into an invincible, ruthless queen. You belong to me, and it belongs to me. Victor murmured, his hand sliding down from my jaw to rest heavily and possessively over the swell of my stomach. You are absolutely magnificent. The sheer overwhelming arrogance of his logic snapped me out of my paralyzing fear. My blood boiled. The maternal instinct that had driven me to fight tooth and nail for the last 4 months roared back to life, violently rejecting his twisted corporate biology. I slapped his hand away. The loud sound of my palm against his skin echoed sharply over the rhythmic heartbeat of the monitor. Victor blinked, genuinely stunned by the physical rejection. No one slapped Victor Sterling. I reached out, snatching the glossy ultrasound film right out of his iron grip. I clutched it to my chest, my eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fury that made his alpha pheromones recoil for a fraction of a second. Listen to me very carefully, Sterling, I hissed, my voice dropping into that dead, calm street thug register that had commanded 50 knife-wielding dockworkers. This is not a genetic experiment. This is not a biological catalyst meant to stroke your massive tyrannical ego. I slid off the examination table, ignoring the wave of dizziness, and stood toe-to-toe with the billionaire. I tilted my chin up, refusing to back down from his formidable gaze. "This baby is mine," I growled, my sweet scent souring into a heavy, combative warning of dark honey and ozone. "It is a person. And if you think for 1 second you are going to treat my child like a corporate asset, a hostile takeover, or a weapon to validate your God complex, I swear to God, Victor, I will take a wrench and finish what Marcus started." For a long, agonizing moment, the room was suspended in a deadly silence. The only sound was the relentless beating of the life growing inside me. Victor stared down at me. The murderous, unhinged CEO slowly melted away. What replaced it was a look of pure, intoxicating reverence. "God," he breathed, a dark, hungry smirk playing on his lips, his eyes dropping to my mouth. "You are absolutely terrifying when you're protective." The morning light in Astoria was perpetually gray, but inside the high-tech command center Victor had built across from the cannery, the lighting was a crisp, punishing, fluorescent white. I sat in a sleek, ergonomic leather chair that probably cost more than Hank's entire fishing boat. I was still wearing my scuffed, mud-caked combat boots, and I made a deliberate point of propping them right on the edge of the polished obsidian conference table. My lower abdomen throbbed with a dull ache, a lingering reminder of the violent contractions from the night before. But my mind had never been sharper. The heavy, sweet scent of dark honey and warm milk bled freely from my unpatched neck, mixing aggressively with the sterile artificial chill of the server room. Victor sat opposite me. He was back in his bespoke armor, a flawless navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie perfectly knotted at his throat. He looked like the ruthless king of Wall Street again, completely masking the blood-soaked beast that had torn Marcus apart with his bare hands just 12 hours prior. The room was practically vibrating with the synchronized hum of 50 high-frequency trading servers. Victor didn't say a word. He simply reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out 2 pristine, heavy cardstock folders. He slid them across the sleek black table. They stopped exactly 2 inches from my boots. "What's this?" I asked, my voice flat, refusing to drop my legs. "Your reality check," Victor replied, his tone smooth, clinical, and laced with absolute authority. "The black folder contains the deed to Hank's cannery, the property rights to all 3 adjoining docks, and the outstanding bank loans of every commercial fisherman in this town. I bought them all at 4 in the morning." I stared at the black folder. He was literally holding the financial lifeblood of the entire town hostage. "And the white folder?" I asked, a dangerous edge creeping into my voice. "A blank marriage certificate," Victor stated, his slate gray eyes locking onto mine with a suffocating, unyielding intensity. "You sign it. We get on my private jet this afternoon. We return to the penthouse. You will be monitored by my elite medical staff until the child is born, and Astoria will be allowed to continue its pathetic, fish-gutted existence. If you refuse, I foreclose on the entire coastline by noon. Everyone you know here goes bankrupt." It was the ultimate alpha play. Corner the prey, cut off all escape routes, and offer a gilded cage as the only salvation. 3 months ago, this kind of raw, tyrannical leverage would have crushed me. I would have cried. I would have signed the paper with a trembling hand to save the people who had taken me in. But I wasn't the fragile, submissive pet he had kept in Manhattan. The sterling DNA mutating inside me had fundamentally rewired my spine. I didn't reach for his folders. Instead, I slowly lowered my boots to the floor. I reached inside my oversized, grease-stained canvas jacket and pulled out a single battered manila folder. It smelled faintly of sea salt, cheap coffee, and fish oil. I slapped it down directly on top of his pristine marriage certificate. The heavy sound of paper against the obsidian table echoed sharply over the hum of the servers. Victor's perfectly sculpted eyebrows twitched. He stared at the filthy folder, genuinely thrown off balance. "What is this?" "My counteroffer," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table, projecting my heavy, combative pheromones straight across the boardroom. "You want me to sign that marriage certificate? Fine. I'll sign it, but under my terms." Victor's eyes narrowed. A dark, dangerous amusement flickered in his gaze. "You are not in a position to dictate terms, Leo. I hold the monopoly on the only thing you actually want in this room, Victor," I retorted, gesturing to my slightly swollen stomach. "So you are going to sit there, shut up, and listen." For a second, I thought he might vault over the table and strangle me. But then, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his long fingers together. "Entertain me. Clause 1. I said, my voice dropping into the dead calm register that commanded the dock workers. I am not going back to the penthouse. I am staying in Astoria. You want a corporate empire. Congratulations. You're looking at the new CEO of Sterling Corporation's global seafood supply chain. I run the West Coast distribution operations from this town. You run the East Coast financials from New York. Victor stared at me, his face an unreadable mask of cold stone. Clause 2. I continued tapping the manila folder. You will legally transfer ownership of Hank's Cannery back to him debt-free. You will fully fund the modernization of the Astoria commercial fleet. I am not abandoning my pack. Your pack is a bunch of toothless, illiterate fishmongers, Victor growled, the heavy scent of angry cedar spiking in the air. They are my employees, I corrected fiercely. And clause 3, the most important one. I paused, holding his lethal gaze without blinking. The baby takes my last name. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute. Even the humming of the servers seemed to vanish. Victor Sterling, the man who demanded his name be plastered on skyscrapers, charities, and global hedge funds, sat perfectly still. He looked at me as if he were seeing a completely alien species. He processed the sheer, unadulterated audacity of a runaway pregnant omega trying to financially and legally strong-arm a billionaire. Then it happened. Victor's chest hitched. A low, vibrating sound started deep in his throat. It bubbled up, breaking through layers of corporate conditioning and ruthless discipline. He laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a deep, chest-rattling, feral roar of pure psychotic delight. The sound echoed wildly off the sterile walls. It was the sound of a control freak realizing he was completely, helplessly addicted to losing control to this specific person. He stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair skidded backward. He crossed the space between us in 2 massive strides, grabbing the armrests of my chair and spinning me around to face him. He braced his arms on either side of me, trapping me against the desk. The scent of cedar washed over me, but it wasn't angry anymore. It was intoxicating. It was a raging, possessive inferno. You beautiful, terrifying little monster. Victor breathed, his eyes completely black with blown-out pupils. You want to be a mafia boss. You want to run a global syndicate from a rotting dock. Fine, I'll buy you the ships. I'll buy you the politicians. I don't give a damn about the fish, Leo. He leaned in, his lips hovering mere millimeters from the healing raw skin of my scent gland. I just need you. He whispered, his voice a ragged, desperate rasp. He didn't wait for permission. He opened his mouth and sank his teeth directly into the junction of my neck and shoulder. I gasped, my hands flying up to grip the lapels of his expensive suit. It wasn't the agonizing chemical burn of the blockers. It was a sharp, biting pain that instantly melted into a heavy narcotic rush of pure alpha claiming. He was marking me, and this time my body didn't reject it. It welcomed the burn, recognizing the monster who would tear the world apart to keep me safe. He pulled back, his lips stained with a drop of my blood, a dark, triumphant smirk playing on his face. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a heavy gold Mont Blanc fountain pen, and tossed it onto the manila folder. Sign the papers, boss, Victor murmured, his eyes blazing with a twisted, obsessive devotion. Let's build an empire. The silence on the 80th floor of the Sterling Tower was completely different from the rotting, wind-battered quiet of the Astoria docks. Up here, floating above the smog of Manhattan, the silence was expensive. It was heavy, climate-controlled, and laced with the suffocating scent of pure, unadulterated financial terror. I stood just outside the heavy, frosted glass double doors of the main boardroom, listening to the muffled, rhythmic tapping of a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen against a mahogany table. Inside, Victor was currently dismantling a conglomerate of European shipping magnates. Your profit margins are a joke, gentlemen. Victor's voice bled through the glass, a low seismic rumble devoid of any human empathy. The heavy scent of bitter ozone and dry cedar seeped under the door, making the 2 heavily armed security guards standing beside me shift nervously on their feet. You operate with the bloated, lethargic arrogance of old money. You have 72 hours to accept my acquisition terms. If you refuse, I will personally crash your stock into pennies by Friday, buy your fleet for scrap metal, and turn your historic shipyards into parking lots. Do we understand each other? I could practically hear the 70-year-old billionaires sweating through their bespoke Italian suits. Victor hadn't lost a single ounce of his ruthlessness. If anything, the last 2 years had only sharpened his teeth. I looked down at my left hand. Tiny, chubby fingers were wrapped tightly around my index finger. Julian, our 2-year-old son, looked up at me. He had my dark hair, but his eyes were a terrifying, identical copy of Victor's flat slate gray irises. He was currently wearing a miniature, heavily studded black leather jacket over a band t-shirt, aggressively chewing on the dorsal fin of a plush, squeaky great white shark. "Ready, boss," I whispered to the toddler. Julian pulled the shark out of his mouth, gave a sharp, definitive nod, and let out a high-pitched, demanding babble. I didn't knock. I raised my foot clad in a polished, custom-made Oxford shoe that had long since replaced my muddy combat boots and kicked the heavy glass door open. The loud noise of the doors hitting the wall echoed like a gunshot in the sterile boardroom. 12 European shipping magnates violently flinched their heads, snapping toward the entrance. The collective gasp of pure, unadulterated outrage sucked the oxygen from the room. No one, absolutely no one, interrupted Victor Sterling during a hostile takeover. They expected the intruder to be immediately shot, or at least fired on the spot. I strolled into the room, my tailored all-black suit contouring perfectly to my frame, radiating the heavy, unmasked scent of dark, honey-warm milk and undeniable territorial dominance. Julian toddled right beside me, his little boots stomping against the marble floor, the plush shark letting out absurd squeaking noises with every other step. The old men stared at us in paralyzed horror, their eyes darting wildly from the toddler chewing on a toy to the demonic CEO sitting at the head of the table. Victor stopped tapping his pen. The murderous, cold-blooded aura that had been suffocating the room instantly evaporated, shattered into a million pieces by the sight of us. He didn't yell. He didn't call for security. Instead, the ruthless tyrant of Wall Street immediately stood up. He bypassed his multi-billion-dollar acquisition files, crossed the room in 3 massive strides, and scooped Julian up into one massive, heavily muscled arm. The toddler giggled immediately, slapping his wet, drool-covered shark directly against the lapel of Victor's $5,000 suit. Victor didn't even blink. With his free hand, Victor pulled out the heavy leather chair directly to his right, the seat meant for the vice chairman, and gestured for me to sit. As I sank into the chair, he reached for a crystal carafe, poured a glass of warm water, and placed it perfectly within my reach. "You're late," Victor murmured, his voice dropping from a terrifying growl into a low, ragged purr of absolute devotion. He leaned down, pressing a lingering, possessive kiss directly over the permanent, scarred bite mark on my scent gland. "Traffic," I lied smoothly, taking a sip of the water. I turned my attention to the 12 pale, hyperventilating executives across the table. They looked as if they were hallucinating. The beast who had just threatened to ruin their families was currently wiping baby spit up off a stuffed fish. I reached across the obsidian table and pulled their financial dossier toward me. I flipped through the pages for exactly 10 seconds before slamming the folder shut. "I reviewed your West Coast distribution network on the ride over," I said, my voice slipping effortlessly into the dead, calm street thug register that had once terrified a warehouse full of dock workers. "It's garbage. Your cold storage facilities in Seattle are outdated, and your union contracts are bleeding you dry." The lead European executive finally found his voice sputtering indignantly. "Mr. Sterling, are you going to allow your Omega to speak to us this way about global logistics?" Victor's gray eyes snapped toward the man. The temperature in the room plummeted below freezing. "You will address him as the CEO of Global Operations." Victor snarled softly, his hand resting heavily, protectively on the back of my chair. "And you will pray he is in a good mood, because I only handle the money. He handles the ships. If you insult my mate again, I will have your tongue served to my dock workers in a tin can." The man visibly shrank into his chair, his face completely devoid of color. I smirked, leaning back and crossing my legs. "As I was saying, we don't want your management. We want your physical cargo ships to expand our Pacific mackerel distribution. We will buy you out at 60 cents on the dollar. You keep your pensions, and we keep the boats. Take it, or I let my husband bankrupt you by Friday." The room was dead silent, save for Julian happily babbling and pulling on Victor's silk tie. The executives looked at the contract, looked at me, and then looked at Victor. The Alpha simply nodded, a dark, incredibly arrogant smile playing on his lips, utterly intoxicated by the sheer ruthlessness of his mate. Defeated, trembling hands reached for their pens. They signed. 10 minutes later, the boardroom was empty, the signed contracts resting on the table. Julian had fallen asleep, his little head resting heavily against Victor's broad chest, securely wrapped in the Alpha's arms. I stood up, walking over to the floor to ceiling windows, looking down at the sprawling, chaotic grid of the city below. The heavy grounding scent of cedar wrapped around me, mixing perfectly with the smell of my own dark honey. Victor stepped up behind me, resting his chin on top of my head, his free arm wrapping securely around my waist. 60 cents on the dollar, Victor whispered, his chest vibrating against my back. You robbed them blind, Leo. You are an absolute menace. I learned from the worst, I replied softly, leaning back into his solid warmth. 3 years ago, I thought my only option was to shrink to hide and to accept the sterile gilded cage he had built for me. I thought loving an alpha like Victor meant sacrificing my own spine. But standing here, running a global syndicate with a man who would gladly burn the world down to keep me warm, I realized the truth. You don't survive a monster by playing the victim. You survive a monster by claiming him. And as Victor pressed another kiss to the crown of my head, holding our sleeping son against his chest, I knew the cage was gone forever. We didn't need it anymore. We had built an empire instead.